Hello everyone! Thank you so much for joining our first ever virtual PD. We are excited to present this multi-series PD to you all. After this PD, we will host a Zoom Q&A session, so please make sure to write down your questions as they come to you. Our PD, Building a Trauma-Informed School, is based off research, a book study, and your team's experiences and training. Your team today is composed of Miss Julie, Miss Lauren, Miss Rachel, Miss Emily, Nurse Sherry, Miss Lucretia, and Miss Siobhan. So why trauma? I know we've talked about trauma and ACE scores before, but right now, more than ever, our children are experiencing even more trauma and adding to their ACE scores due to school closures and COVID-19. When our scholars come back in July, we want everyone to be prepared with an even sharper and deepened toolbox. So ready? Here we go. Trauma is a distressing experience or set of experiences that threaten a person's actual safety or perceived sense of safety to such a degree that it exceeds an individual's capacity to cope in healthy ways. It is important to note that these experiences can be real but can also be perceived. These traumatic experiences can produce feelings of terror, helplessness, and fear. Keep in mind that what you perceive as trauma might not be traumatic for someone else, and vice versa. For some people, trauma occurs monthly, weekly, and even daily. You might have even heard one of our scholars or someone you know say, "I'm used to it. It's no big deal." While this is their norm and they think they are used to it, it takes a toll on them mentally, emotionally, and physically, even if they don't recognize it. I sometimes like to play a game, myth or fact. So I'm going to ask you two questions and I want you to think, is this a myth or is this a fact? Experiencing trauma at a young age is less damaging than someone who is older. Myth or fact? If a child cannot remember a traumatic event, it had no effect on them. If you guessed myth, you are correct. The younger the child, the more damaging trauma is on the developing brain and body, even if the child can't remember the traumatic event. Once children have been traumatized, they are 2 to 7 times more likely to experience traumatization. This often creates more negative effects than the sum of each individual trauma alone. When children experience traumatic events and don't have explicit memory of the event, they cannot create a narrative to help them heal from the experience. This, in turn, makes it harder to identify triggers. When young children have these experiences, it is very likely that their relative, parent, guardian has also been traumatized, so it is critical that we help not only the child, but their parent as well.
Trauma experienced as a child manifests in several ways at school, from behavior issues to physical concerns. Many times, physical complaints can be vague in nature when communicated in the classroom setting. In most cases, children may not or cannot express their true concerns. Early childhood trauma has a valid footing in physical health. Each trauma experienced triggers the fight or flight response, a working part of the inflammatory system, and can play a significant role in many childhood illnesses, such as asthma, panic disorders, and gastrointestinal problems. If you will look at this slide, you can see that a lot of times their complaints are vague. When they come to the health room to see the nurse, we do make sure that everything is documented. We do track the data. We do pay attention to those that come in often, the time of day they're coming, and we do follow up with our MTSS team if we think that we're seeing something that may need to have follow-up or further investigation. Keep in mind that the effects of trauma on the body are long-lasting and forever. By disrupting the inflammatory system, long-term aberrations in the body's organ systems can become chronic health issues and put individuals at an increased risk for cardiovascular disease, metabolic disorders, kidney disease, and even some cancers. Along with that, we have an increased risk for depression, anxiety, obesity, smoking, substance abuse, and promiscuity. The two go hand in hand as comorbid conditions.
It's Miss Emily. I'm going to talk to you guys about my favorite thing in the whole world, which is the human brain. So I'm going to talk you through how the human brain works together and how it responds to stress and how it responds to traumatic stress. So our brain develops in three distinct layers, and the brainstem, our reptilian brain, the limbic brain, which is our mammal brain, and then the beautiful prefrontal cortex, which only us fabulous humans have. And the developmental psychologist Becky Bailey has assigned a very interesting question to each layer of the brain to help us understand what its purpose is and what it's trying to accomplish. So for that first layer of the brain, the reptilian brain, the brainstem, it's asking, am I safe? Black and white. It is a yes or no answer. Now the limbic brain is asking, am I loved? Do I belong? So this part of the brain has big feelings and big memories. The amygdala, which is our fear-based response system, is sandwiched between those two parts of the brain. So it's this part of the brain that helps us feel connected and have relationships and be attuned to one another. And then the prefrontal cortex is asking, what can I learn from this? That question is a teacher's dream, and it's this part of the brain that you're hoping to engage and continue to build, because none of our kids have fully developed brains because they're not over the age of 25. That's how long it takes to fully develop the human brain. Some of our younger kids, so our 3, 4, and 5K, don't even really have the prefrontal cortex on board yet. That's like barely starting construction. So you guys are going to have a lot of great influence on how this structure of the brain fits together. But the reality is you're only going to access that part of the brain when they're regulated. When we as human beings are regulated, all three of those layers are working together. But when we are dysregulated, the prefrontal cortex starts to go offline, and then you're just working from your limbic system and your brainstem. And to kind of flesh out this idea, I'm going to walk you through the human arousal states. Now, when I say arousal, that's the scientific term for how our body responds to stress. So that stress could be someone cutting you off in traffic. It could be having a difficult conversation with a coworker. It could just be the normal stress of running late. Stress. So it exists on this continuum. So on one end, we've got a low energy response to stress. And then on the other end, we've got a high energy response to stress. And our neural circuitry in our brain is constantly making teeny tiny adjustments to bring us up and down this scale. Now, all of these responses are great. We need high energy responses when someone cuts us off in traffic and we have to swerve so we don't get hit. And we need low energy responses when we're really stressed out and the only thing we really need to do is sleep. So all of this is good. However, we want our experiences of stress to be short in duration and infrequent in occurrence. And that's true for you guys as teachers. We want you to feel stressed only a little bit of the time and only every once in a while. And it's very true for our kids. So right in the middle here, we are regulated. Now, when I explain this scale to kiddos, I'll use the words too little for low energy. I'll say we have too little feelings here. Or on the other end, it's too much. It's too many feelings. And then right in the middle is just right. And the scientific words are hypo arousal, hyper arousal, and then flooded. So I'm going to walk you through how you're going to see this in your kids. So as you look out on your classroom to be able to know like, ooh, this kid is having a low energy response to stress. This kid is in hyper arousal. This kid is flooded. So you can better tailor your day to help keep everybody as much as possible in these green zones. And the metaphor I like to use is the river of feelings. And this is how I explain it to kids as well. So feel free to give this tool to your classroom. You just might not use all of the sciencey words I'm about to. So The river starts with a creek, just a little bit of water, a little bit of energy. And then as it goes up, it gains water and momentum until all the way at the end where there's a lot of water, a lot of chaos, and then it cascades over the waterfall. That waterfall dumps itself out into another river, which winds its way along and slowly loses energy until it's just a creek again. So that's the cycle. And in the middle of this, we've got our green zone. So in our green zone, we are regulated, we feel calm, we're able to focus and think creatively and engage with other people. We love the green zone. The physical signs of being in the green zone is going to be eye contact, smiles, talking slowly, not like super slow, but just not you're not super regulated. So being able to talk at a normal pace, regulated, love life. Now we're gonna head down the river into the blue zone or hypo arousal. So hypo arousal is where our nervous system senses a stressor and then wants to throw on the brakes. So we become disconnected from our environment and from our outside stressors. So you're going to see a child in the blue zone be kind of disengaged. The physical signs are going to be a monotone voice, an expressionless face, maybe a gazing off into the distance, a slumped posture, and a slow response to stimulus. A lot of times when you see kids in the blue zone, it can be easy to think that they're just daydreamers or unmotivated or lazy, but that's not the case. They're actually experiencing stress, and the way their body has decided to deal with it is just to disconnect. And when they disconnect, there's a real problem with memory acquisition. So when someone is in hypoarousal, they are not going to remember the information that's coming to them from their environment because they're disconnected from their environment. So when you have a child like this, who's just kind of looking off in the distance, quiet, not bothering anybody, maybe slumped over a little bit, they're not bothering anybody, but they aren't learning either. So on the flip side, as we go the other way on this river, we've got the orange zone. And so this is hyperarousal. Now, I think the best example of hyperarousal is if you are in the hallway with your classroom and one of your kids is acting up and you give them a correction to check their body and they don't take it well. You might see their skin get flushed. You might see their pupils dilate a little bit. Their body language might get rigid. Their hands might ball up into fists. They put it behind their back, and their eyes will start to dart everywhere. And if, somehow someone in your line laughs about something, maybe not at this kid, maybe it's something random, they might shoot off because they're very sensitive in that moment. That's hyperarousal. So in hyperarousal, your blood pressure is going to go up. Your breathing rate is going to go up. Your eyes are going to be darting around the room trying to find a sense of danger, and you're going to be very sensitive to the stimulus in your environment. So that's why the looks on people's faces, the tones of their voice, the noises that they hear, kids in hyperarousal are very sensitive to all of those things, more so than actual logic. And the other thing you might sometimes hear from a child who's in this orange zone is that they have some kind of body discomfort. They'll have a headache, they'll have a stomach ache, that kind of thing. If you're familiar with the hand model of the brain, this is not a flipped lid. This is like when you pop your trunk and it's just like open, but it's not totally ajar. That's what this is like. This is like a popped lid. So it's disconnected, but it's not totally gone yet. Flooded, on the other hand, is gone. It's gone and it's done. So when you're in a flooded arousal state, you are acting from a place of complete terror or rage. And your body kind of has three avenues to go down: fight, flight, or freeze. And you guys know this, so I'm not going to go into super detail about it. I'm just going to try and cover maybe some of the things that we don't think about when we process fight, flight, and freeze. So for fight, when a body is starting to fight back, it's from a place of self-defense. And they are fighting against a real or perceived threat. So we in our adult brains and our adult bodies might know that this child is not in danger and is not in threat, but the child does not know that, not at all. So flight sometimes looks exactly like what it sounds like, just running away from you down the hall. But sometimes it can be more subtle. It can be removing yourself from a group of other people, or if a kid like throws their hoodie on and starts to hide in their jacket and they don't want to respond anymore. You'll also see kids start to hide under things. So they'll crawl under tables, under chairs, or fit their bodies into small spaces like cubbies and bathrooms, closets, that kind of thing. And that's for two reasons. Number one, it's to provide a sense of safety and security. They are acting fully from that brainstem who's saying, am I safe? I don't know. And so they're going to try and fit their bodies into a small space to give them a sense of safety, and to also bring down the stimulus they're experiencing. When you're in a flooded state, all the stimulus in your environment is very overwhelming. You're not just sensitive, you're overwhelmed. And so putting yourself in a small space decreases the amount of stimulus you're going to be experiencing. And then freeze. Freeze is different than hypoarousal. Freeze is where your nervous system has thrown all of its weight onto the gas and the brakes. So this kid is going to be very rigid in posture. Pupils are going to be very dilated. They're going to be very focused, have a lot of energy. They just won't be moving. And sometimes they won't be talking either. They might be mute. Universal physical signs are going to be, like I've said, rigid muscles, erratic movement, impulsive movement, and erratic speech. When a child is in a flooded zone, when we are in a flooded zone, we no longer have access to the higher verbal structures of our prefrontal cortex. So whatever a kid might be saying in a flooded zone does not necessarily need to be engaged in that moment. If you've ever seen Marvey in kindergarten completely flip his lid because there's not pizza in the cafeteria, you'll know what I'm talking about. Like, that's not the moment to tell him, like, I know there's not pizza, but we need to figure out something else to eat, because it's not about pizza. Like, his speech is erratic and impulsive, and it is not logical or like grounded in reality. So you don't need to get into an argument or try and like create some kind of logic in that moment. You just need to bring this child back to a regulated place. Now that is what the river of feelings looks like for everybody. You experience this, I experience this, all of our kids experience this, regardless of trauma. Now we add trauma in the mix, and this is how it gets different. Do you see the difference? Our green zone is half. It is cut in half, as well as our orange zone. And so there is much more space in this river to be in hypoarousal or completely flooded. The situations in which a child feels safe and regulated, where their brain says, am I safe? Yes. Am I loved? Do I belong? Yes. Okay, what can I learn? Those situations are few and far between, because they're much more used to danger. Their brain is trying to keep them alive, and so wants to keep them hypervigilant. The other thing to note about this river is that the current is very strong, and so they may be in a green spot. It will take very little to get them flooded and all the way over that waterfall. The other thing to note is that sometimes kids are going to go all the way over that waterfall, dump down, come back around, and then meet back up through hypoarousal. They're not actually going to hit regulated at first. So if you've got a kid who's completely flooded, you sent them off with Miss Rachel or Miss Lauren to help get their self-control back, and now they're back in the classroom. look for those signs of hypoarousal because more than likely they're still not fully regulated. When your body hits that flooded territory, it takes a full 20 minutes to come back. 20 full minutes. So, more than likely, your student is still going to need some nurture and some compassion and some help getting all the way into their green zone.
Now we're going to talk about memory and how it plays a role in children's experiences of trauma. So there are two main types of memory. There are explicit memories, which are facts, events, and autobiographical information. These are stored in long-term memory and can be easily accessed and intentionally recalled and recited. So if I ask you for your social security number or the name of your kindergarten teacher or the name of the first president of the United States, you would be accessing explicit memory to answer those types of questions. Explicit memory begins functioning at around 18 months of age. The second type of memory is implicit memory, and these are body sensations, emotions, perceptions, and behaviors or procedures. And examples of implicit memory include brushing your teeth, driving a car, riding a bike, or even if I asked you, what does it feel like when somebody you love gives you a hug, or the feeling when you walk along the beach? You can kind of picture those things and feel them, but they're really hard to put into words because they're so ingrained in us and they're stored as implicit memories. And implicit memory begins functioning before birth. You may be wondering why we're talking about memory. The arousal states Miss Emily talked about, so hypoarousal, hyperarousal, and flooded states, occur in our students who have experienced trauma when either an explicit or an implicit memory is triggered. So if something happens that makes a child recall specific details of a trauma or explicit memory of that trauma, or something happens at school that makes him feel the same way that he did during a traumatic event, or an implicit memory, a trauma response can be triggered by either of those. So there's this quote, "The body keeps the score." Because the body can remember the sensations, emotions, and perceptions surrounding a traumatic event, trauma responses can be triggered without any explicit memory of the event because the child still likely remembers implicitly those sensations, emotions, and perceptions. This is because adrenaline, which enhances implicit memory, is released during stressful events. So then when adrenaline is released later because of a trigger, those implicit memories can be brought back without any actual knowledge of the event happening. Because implicit memory begins functioning before birth, one of the crazy things is that a child whose mother experienced a traumatic event while pregnant could have trauma responses triggered for an event that he or she wasn't even alive to remember or to have experienced. And so this can sound pretty disheartening because a child doesn't even have to be alive to be traumatized. However, the good news is that we don't have to know what a child has been through, and the child doesn't have to have any explicit memory of the traumatic event for us to be able to help them through their trauma responses. So now that we know how trauma responses are triggered through memory, we're going to go over some common triggers that may come up in the classroom. So kids can be triggered by anything that brings up either an explicit or an implicit memory of their traumatic event or experience. So it's not your job to avoid every possible trigger because it's impossible. However, it is important to try to identify what triggers your students and try to avoid those things if at all possible. Sometimes it's not possible to avoid something that we know is triggering. And if that's the case, make sure you let somebody on our team know so that we can help you figure out ways to support your child, or we can even go into the classroom to help support that child through the potentially triggering experience. While we're talking about triggers, I want you to write down students who come to mind and the triggers that you associate with them, so that we can talk about those later, and also so that you can send those things or that information on to next year's teachers so that they don't have to go through as much trial and error trying to figure out what may or may not trigger a student at the beginning of next year. So some examples of things that may trigger a trauma response in a student that would be in our classrooms include things like rest time or quiet time. So depending on the type of trauma and the environment in which it occurred, forcing a student to sit in the dark or to lie down or put their head down, sit quietly, those types of things may trigger traumatic responses because they could remind them of that original event. Safety lessons on abuse, so like the ones that Miss Julie does every year, intruder drills, field trips to places like hospitals, fire departments, police stations, those types of things can be triggering depending on what a child has been through. Class assignments and reading materials can trigger trauma responses depending on the content. So for example, if you ask your students to bring in baby pictures and you have a student who was adopted after whatever that event or whatever that age was. So you want pictures before they were 4. The child was adopted at 5. They may not have any pictures from when they were younger, or if they were in foster care during that time. Those types of assignments can bring up negative emotions and experiences in those children. Another example is reading materials. So themes in things that we read often include parental abandonment or death, life as an orphan, child abuse, domestic violence, fires, other emotional experiences that may be similar to things that our children have experienced. So we need to be mindful of what our kids have been through and what may potentially trigger them. We don't expect you to just get rid of any assignments or reading materials or books in your classrooms that may potentially trigger a student. However, if you know that one of your kids has been through something similar to the content that you're covering, make sure that you let one of us know and possibly talk to their parents or to the child themselves to try and figure out what we can do to accommodate or make modifications to the assignments if we need to. So something could include things like giving them an alternate but comparable assignment to complete that may have a different topic that could not be triggering for them, or having somebody sit in the room with them while you're covering that topic so that we can pull them out if it becomes too overwhelming for them. In addition to external triggers, there can be internal triggers that can result in a trauma response in the classroom. So things that are internal states or emotions that remind them of past traumas. So one of the big ones that we see in a lot of our students are fear and shame states. Any situation that provokes even natural degrees of anxiety or fear can bring up implicit memories of past traumatic states in our students. So things that wouldn't seem overwhelming to a typical student, or that may be kind of tough to deal with or to listen to, so topics that might be hard to hear about. But if we have good coping skills, we can get through them easily. Those same types of things can trigger a trauma response in another student who may not have those types of coping skills already developed. And so one of the big ones, like I said, is fear and shame states. So child abuse and neglect especially contribute to high levels of shame, whereby children feel as though they are bad and unworthy of anything good. When they feel shame in even non-traumatic situations, such as being in trouble with an authority figure, so you as teachers and us as adults in the classrooms, being embarrassed by peers, getting in a conflict with another student, experiencing what they see as academic failure, even if they're not doing that poorly, if they don't feel like they're doing good enough. Those types of things can trigger bigger and more overwhelming trauma-induced shame states. And so those things, when they're activated, could result in fight, flight, and freeze responses in your classroom. Any overwhelming sensory experience can also be triggering. So those could include loud noises that remind them of something that happened during that trauma experience, certain smells, touch, physical proximity, tastes, facial expressions. So kids can be really sensitive to different facial expressions. So if you say something, but you're kind of furrowing your brow or look similar to a perpetrator in a traumatic experience that they've had, those can all trigger responses in our students who have had these types of experiences. Tone of voice and volume are really big triggers that can result in fear and shame states as well. It's habit for us to try to motivate our students or get their attention by using a stern voice or speaking loudly. However, this may create a sense of fear in a child who has been traumatized. It's counterproductive to use those really loud voices or talk really sternly because it can trigger those students, which ultimately stops them from thinking and learning and could lead to even worse behavior. So one example of this is in one of my current foster children. If we speak to him sternly at all, he completely shuts down. We can't get him to say or do anything. I had to work with him and get him regulated again, which often takes a while and ends up taking a lot more time and energy than whatever it was that I needed fixed. I can say the exact same thing to him, but using a more calm, gentle, and kind tone. And he's able to usually quickly fix whatever the behavior is that I'm having trouble with or that I need him to fix, and then we can move on. So it's natural for me to get louder when I'm angry or frustrated or he needs to start moving or fix whatever it is. And I often have to stop myself and take a step back and remember that if I'm telling him to hurry up and I'm saying it loudly and angrily, he's going to end up shutting down instead. So I have to think about the tone. So it's not just what we say, it's how we say it, which we've heard a million times. But it really is true for kids who have had these traumatic experiences. So we need to remember that it's okay to be firm, but we also need to be kind in how we're talking to our students, especially those who have been through tough experiences, which realistically are most of our students. One of the craziest things is that many times students can be triggered without us realizing it and without them not realizing it either. A lot of times they can't tell us what triggered them. They may be able to recognize that they're having big feelings, but they have no idea why. So another example of this is one of my previous foster children. She would go straight into a flooded state. She would throw things, flip over furniture, physically attack us, and run away, just run out the door. And we had no idea why. When we finally caught up to her, we were able to regulate her, which usually took about at least 20 to 30 minutes. And we would start trying to process what had happened. Most of the time, she couldn't tell us what triggered her. And so we couldn't figure it out either. And so we had a really hard time preventing those outbursts from happening. So it can be really tricky. And it takes a lot of observation to figure out what is triggering a behavior. And you aren't expected to do this on your own. You're teaching a lot of kids all at once. And it's really hard to figure these things out. So if you have a kid who is struggling behaviorally, please call in somebody from our team and we can observe and try and figure out what types of things are setting off those trauma responses, because we don't want these kids to be experiencing those. It's not good for them. It's not good for your classroom and the learning of other students. And so we really want to help you figure this out so that we can help our students. Like I said earlier, we won't be able to avoid all possible triggers, especially because sometimes we won't be able to figure out what the triggers are to begin with. The most important thing is to make sure that we have a plan in place to support those students when things do trigger their trauma responses. And we'll talk about specific approaches and techniques to use in future trainings. And the last thing that I want to talk about is that this unemotional response does not equal resiliency. So, although we oftentimes notice those really dramatic emotional responses, those big blow ups, the aggression, the yelling, the talking back, things like that, when a child is triggered, some children cope with trauma by shutting down instead. Like I said, with one of my foster children. And sometimes those kids can be overlooked in a classroom because we do have those other kids with those more externalizing problems. However, we really need to be vigilant and make sure we don't overlook those kids because they may be suffering in silence and they may need help to get through their trauma responses as well. And we want to make sure that we don't overlook them. So please write down any questions that you have about this topic so that I can talk to you about them later.
Hey everyone! First of all, I miss you guys a lot. I miss being in your classrooms and with your kiddos and just around the school and that community. So I know that we have talked, our team, all through this presentation about trauma, and now that you have kind of a greater base of knowledge of what trauma is and how it can affect the classroom, I want to end us with a metaphor. So the metaphor is this idea of being lifeguards and swim coaches. We have both of those roles in any setting where we're working with children. So you guys have both of those roles in your classrooms. Lauren and I have both of those roles in our rooms. Emily has both of those roles in her room. Julie has both of those roles when she has kids. And so I just want to go through what those are. So we have to be a lifeguard in the classroom. We have to keep kids safe and make sure they feel safe. And it's really important to recognize that those are not the exact same thing. So keeping kids safe just is physical safety. Like, our school is a safe place, and we make choices every day to make sure that everyone knows that our school is a safe place. But children still are not always going to feel safe in our classrooms, which is why we say it over and over. We talk about how we're safe, why we're safe, what is safe about our school. We ask our kids what they think is safe. If they're acting like they don't feel safe, we can ask them why they don't feel safe or what feels unsafe to them. It also, lifeguarding is jumping in and helping kids stay afloat in tough moments. So that means co-regulating. It means being there with a child. If you have younger kids and sometimes even older ones, if you have a really good relationship with them, it could mean having an arm around them, giving them a hug, having like them sitting on your lap, holding them, but having that co-regulation where they can feel you breathing, they can feel that it's okay, and it's going to be okay, that we will not feel like this forever. It's the message of, I am with you, you are safe, I have you, we'll figure this out together. And so these are for the moments when children are deregulated, when they're already in that unregulated state, that we dive in to help bring them back to the surface and we ride it out with them. A lot of times, lifeguarding is also jumping in to help and then calling Lauren or I. This is a lot of the times that Lauren and I jump in and we act as co-lifeguards with you guys and help kids get regulated again. But we also need to be swim coaches in the classroom. It can't only ever be about jumping in and saving them. We have to teach them and reinforce those regulation skills. One of the really important things with this is we have to build relationships. We talk all the time about relationships. If we don't have a relationship with a child, they're not going to trust us to teach them the social emotional pieces of their education. And so building that relationship also leads to attunement, which I'm going to talk about later, and can lead you to where you can see a child and figure out, like, what do they need from me right now? Do they need me to jump in and save them, or can I stand back and say, you've got this, you have the skills, you've practiced them, and I believe in you. So knowing which role to play, the goal would be a gradual increase of responsibility for self. It's similar to what you guys already use for academic success and independence. You teach it and you do a lot of hand-holding and scaffolding at the beginning, and then you want them to keep getting more and more independent with their work. One trap to be careful of, I think this happens in academic too, but especially with social emotional learning, is the attitude of like, you had these skills yesterday, so you should have them today. Because they really might not. It might be that something terrible happened last night, that there was a fight in their house, or a fight in the neighborhood, or they didn't get a good dinner, or all kinds of different things could have happened that make it so that the skills that we taught them yesterday, they do not have today. And so we have to be patient in those moments. And then it's all about attunement. When we're always on lifeguard duty. As teachers, you know this. You're always looking and watching and feeling the mood of your class and feeling what's going on. This is a head and heart job. We have to be in relationship with kids in order to be attuned to their needs in the moment and know whether to save or challenge. And we're going to make mistakes. And I think that's really important because it's our job. And this is a job for a human, not a robot. We open ourselves up to those human weaknesses, to our own bad days, to those split-second misjudgments in a room full of children where you thought that they could handle this one and then they throw something at you. Like that it happens. And so it's okay to fall back and adjust. It's okay to switch from swim coaching to lifeguarding. And it's okay to ask for help, to call us in and let us help you. And then we'll make a plan for next time. I've told teachers over and over and over, I've told you guys, what I do today that works may not work tomorrow. And that's going to be true in your classroom too. The other thing that's important is repairing that relationship after things go wrong so that children know it is still safe. You can still trust me. We are still okay. And we're going to keep figuring this out together. So what does it take to be a great swim coach? So it talks a lot in the book that we read about just right arousal, that children are at an optimal place for learning when they're in that sweet spot where they're not overly aroused and they're not under aroused. This is true. That's true for all learning, for academic learning, but also for social emotional learning. We need to practice when everything is peaceful. So that means that we teach it when things are good and we reinforce it. So we teach taking deep breaths. We teach taking a walk. We teach moving yourself to take a break. All those things when everybody's fine. Everybody's peaceful. We don't have any problems. Because nobody can learn to swim while they're drowning. And I think this is really important. When a child is actively dysregulated and they're drowning, we just jump in and save them. We jump in, we save them, we help them get back to the surface, and they get everything calm again. That's full-on lifeguarding when they're drowning. We have to jump in and help them figure it out. And then we can circle back afterwards to teaching. So if they are screaming, if they're storming out of your room, if they're trying to run, if they're just yelling at you or arguing and they won't stop, that's probably not the right time to try and teach these skills. Like we have to get back to even, and then we teach the skills there. And if we can plan with the child, even better. If it's an older child, even some younger children, to say like, hey, this really didn't go well. Like this was really rough. What can we do differently? And then the last thing I want to say is the way that we get really good at this, at being attuned to our kids and knowing when it's time to lifeguard and when it's time to teach them to swim, is that we try and we try and we try again. Our kids can learn this. They can learn to do it. They're not going to learn to do it in every single moment. They're not going to learn to do it perfectly. I don't do it perfectly. I had at least one time that comes immediately to mind just in the few months that I was at the school where I walked into our room with a child in my arms and said in a forced friendly voice, Miss Lauren's going to start helping you right now, and put him down the floor and walked out because I was not regulated anymore because he was hitting and kicking and scratching and I was tired. So just know that just like we don't stay perfectly regulated in every moment, our kids aren't going to either. But they can learn it and do it most of the time with reinforcement and if they are in relationship with us. I can't wait to talk to you guys in part 2.